Drawing can be significantly easier than you think, but I think there's one thing that holds a lot of beginners back. They make their assets too complicated, and they focus on trying to make accurate art instead of nice looking art. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Making simple art that has some appeal. We're making 2 simple scenes and 2 simple animations, all focused on just making something kind of passable, even if you're new to drawing. This is a bit simpler than what I usually do, but even if you think this scene is kind of ugly, the principles I talk about are the same I use when I make my other scenes. It's important that you understand the idea of why I draw like this. This art doesn't look flashy, but it's important that we start with the simple before we move on to the complex. If we take a look at this scene, it doesn't look too bad. And if we take this asset here and just look at it, we can see that it actually isn't that complex. But can you tell what the asset is depicting? Yeah, of course, it's a bush. How do we make something that is essentially just a blob shape and some bubbly lines, but something that immediately tells the viewer, hey, that's a bush? We forget about how a bush might look in the real world and just focus on trying to communicate the idea of a nice cute bush in as simple of a way as possible. This is achievable even if you can't draw. Even if you might want to draw a flower by looking at something like this flower and just straight up trying to draw it, this will almost always end up looking horrible. You might even exclaim during the process that you can't draw, but to me this has nothing to do with your ability to draw, this is just kind of being insane. It's like trying to do a cartwheel when you've barely learned how to walk. And it's actually even worse than that, because even though you could draw a flower like a copy machine, you generally wouldn't. You don't start trying to copy complexity, you build complexity layer by layer. Just like with this bush asset, I started out with something simple and made it more complex with time. Even a fairly intricate asset like this starts from something simple. So it's generally better to first learn to make something simple, learn to do it well, before you move on to this type of complex stuff. I'll be releasing all the assets from this video on my Patreon for free. You don't have to become a member, just note that they won't be in a production ready state. They look like they look. So before we get into how to make each individual asset, I just want you to understand the process, how assets are made. It's easy to think that when we draw a rock, that we're trying to represent the real world, but that is only part of what we're doing. What we're really doing is trying to communicate the concept of a rock to another person, the viewer. This means that we don't really need to copy exactly what makes a rock a rock. We just need to capture enough detail to make you think that what I drew was a rock rather than a bush. So I kind of like to think of our job a bit like Pictionary. If you're not as old as me, I think Draw Something is a similar type of game. Our most important job is to make it as easy as possible for another person to recognize and be able to guess what it is that we're drawing. And we can do this with 3 things: the shape, the details, and the color. The color is actually less important, so we'll get to it later on. But we start out with the shapes and silhouettes. So what about the shapes? If you were to see this shape, what would you guess that it is? Hopefully, your first guess is a sign. What about this? Well, hopefully, a pot with flowers. And this? Well, a pillar, a tree, a bush. Whatever asset you're creating, this silhouette and this basic shape is pretty much the most important decision you make for that asset. This is pretty much why every single Pokemon can be instantly recognized by their silhouette. Even more complex art tends to have an identifiable silhouette. As I said, our job is to make it easy for another person to be able to identify what we're drawing. And the first thing they're going to see is the shape. So for everything we draw, we start out with the shape and we try to make that shape both memorable and identifiable. But a shape is obviously not the only thing our art consists of. It also consists of some details. So what about the details? Well, obviously, we need to add something other than just our silhouette, but it's important that with whatever details we add, we're still trying to communicate to the player something about our material. So how do we do that? Well, a rock, for instance, has a rough surface and it has cracks. So if you want something to look like a rock instead of a tree, we find a way to represent a rough texture and crack. But even though this is a detail we're adding, we're still trying to simplify the real world. I'm not trying to replicate this exact texture. I'm just trying to communicate that this type of crack exists. I'm just trying to communicate that these type of small holes might exist. Now, different artists choose to simplify materials in different ways, but they're all still trying to capture the idea of those objects. If we look at how I tend to simplify leaves, we often get this type of balloon thing, whereas other artists simplify their leaves in a completely different way. However, the key part here is that we have both found a way to communicate the idea of a leaf to our audience. This simplification of the real world is sometimes called a shorthand, and well, this is what I like to call it. And the reason why it's so useful to conceptualize this idea of the shorthand is that this trick doesn't just help you communicate a material or a texture, it actually also kind of becomes your style. So by finding a good shorthand to represent an object, you also help unify your art. But it's also really useful to have a shorthand like these bubble things, because it helps you represent any and all bushes without actually having to reference an actual bush. I can just draw an object and go, oh, and I want a small bush on the side. Blub blub blub, done. Now I get both stylistic consistency and I get to draw quickly. And I like to draw quickly. So let's start drawing our assets. So let's start by drawing some tiles. So the first actual asset we might want is just something to replace our gray boxed environment. And I'm going to make an auto tile texture to do this. This is good to do, but I have done a video on this before where I made these 3 textures. So I'm going to use my own guide texture for this. In this case, we're kind of forced to use a basic shape, the block shape, and then we need to follow that shape. We don't need to think about our silhouette much more than that. The only thing we can alter and play around with is the detail. So if you're doing blocks, you might be making different sets of squares. And here we have my version of making this type of square and rock version. If we look at Rogue Legacy, they have done essentially the same thing. If we look at Hollow Knight, they often have these small rocks, something I've also done before. Momodora has this point grass texture. So how do we want to do our tile texture? Well, suppose we also want to make it a plant texture, something grass-like. Do we want it to be pointy like in Momodora? Well, there are pointy leaves, so you can do that type of shorthand. Remember, the shorthand is how we simplify the real world. But there are rounded leaves as well, so let's go for rounded leaves. The only thing I need to worry about when doing a tile is to match up the point at each square, and then I do some half circles. Is this enough? Does this look like a leaf? Well, kind of, but it might as well be a cloud. Okay, so then we think, what does a leaf have that we might want to communicate to really sell the idea that it's a leaf and not a cloud? Well, they tend to have this stem thing here in the middle, so we just add a few of those. And now it kind of looks like a leaf. You see, you might be inclined to just add a ton of stuff to your asset because a leaf has a ton of detail and texture. But you don't have to. You often need very little to sell the idea of a thing. This went from a cloud to a leaf with just a tiny line on a few of these bubbles. And we can look in our game and we have a nice plant leaf texture. But the important thing here is that this was easy to do. It looks clean, but we just made some round shape and a line every once in a while. Now your inclination might be to think about how to do your texture or how to add more detail, but I don't think we should do that yet. The problem if we overwork our tiles at this point is that we might struggle to get our other assets to fit with these tiles. It's better to go step by step with all of our assets at the same time. Now we'll note that just because I did this with my thick black outline, you don't have to. As we saw with Momodora, they don't. If we look at Adventure Pals, they have a softer kind of outline. And more than that, they don't make this round shape for every single step. They go straight for a bit, and then they add some pointy bubbles, and then straight for a bit. They have a different shorthand, just enough to sell the idea that we're dealing with a kind of grass. If you want to see a completely different shorthand for how to do plants, we can look at Wonder Boy, where we have this almost kind of fiery, thin, fluid shape. It looks really nice, but it still captures the idea that it's grass in very few strokes. So this is really grass-like, whereas what we did was more bush or leaf-like. But they still give a similar vibe that we're in a forest. And if you want to look at the high definition version of not using an outline, we can look at Rayman. This can be trickier to do with this type of bushy grass, and this is difficult because we need to kind of build our detail with a different shade of color. Here we have a similar type of shorthand that I made a long time ago. It's kind of a softer look, but I'm just trying to hint at the idea that these are some different types of grass shapes. And I'm kind of mixing a lot of different versions. Conceivably, we could probably make a grass texture just out of this shape. So you see, even though I'm doing this cloud thing here, we actually have a lot of different freedom in choosing how we want to communicate grass or plants. The only thing I would be mindful of is to not overdo it. Like you could technically communicate something grass-like by doing a weird shorthand like crosshatches. It technically works, but it kind of ruins the shape. And as we said, the shape matters. We always want to add details that still respect our shape. But just because I do it this way does not mean you have to do it this way. We each have our own shorthand, so don't be scared to experiment. And don't be scared to take inspiration from others. Now we can move on to the next asset. What do we want that asset to be? Well, let's add some cheese. We are in a forest after all. So as I said in the beginning of this video, if you want to draw any asset, you generally want the shape of the asset itself to communicate what the asset is. So I recommend that we just start thinking about the shape. What's the shape of a tree? I tend to pick a gray color and a fairly big size on my brush, and then I just think about how a tree looks. If I see a tree from far away, it has a bushy top and a rectangle sticking out from the bottom. So if I make sure to add these two ideas, people will get that it's a tree. So I make some small cloud-like shape at the top and a small rectangle at the bottom. Is this good enough? No, it looks bad. Why does it look bad? Is it because we can't draw? Well, maybe. But being hard on ourselves doesn't help. We need to stop and try and identify what it is about it that we don't like. Well, it kind of looks weird that we have all this fluffy stuff on the sides here, but just a small popsicle stick in the middle. We would kind of think that some branches would be pointing to this part of the bush. So let's try adding some branches. Does this look good? Well, it looks better. You might even be happy with this. I think it looks a bit too much like a broccoli, so I'm going to fluff out the stem a bit and add some base to the tree. Nothing much, we don't have to overdo it. How about now? Does it look like a tree? Well, kind of, but now it's a bit thick on the bottom here, but not that much on the bush. So we thicken the bush a bit. Maybe we add a small broken twig thing on the side. Now I will note that when we're doing an asset, this thing with the twig here is a dangerous thing to do. The reason for this is that you make your asset asymmetrical and easily identifiable. It becomes easy to recognize that it is the copy that you're using. Not the end of the world, just be aware of it. But as you can see, we haven't added anything yet. No texture, but if you showed this to someone, they would go, that's a tree. And this is really good. We have already achieved our first goal. It might not look the best, but at least people know what we're trying to draw. So now we can move on to the details of the tree. At the base, we can follow the same principle as we did for our tiles. We don't need to overcomplicate things. Just because we can make it different, doesn't mean we should make it different. So since we're going for this thick outline style, we can just straight up outline the shape of this tree trunk. But now we come to the top bush of the tree, the leaves. How do we make the leaves? We're still going for a type of shorthand. We could technically do it really round, like we did for our bush leaves. But we could also make it sort of round but droopy. Make it hang a bit more. It's a very similar decision to how we did it before, just a bit different. We just imagine that we want to convey some gravity. We could still add a line or two here if we wanted to. We could even make some cuts in some leaves if we wanted to, but we don't have to. Making a tiny small different decision, like the droopy leaves, even if it seems like it's too similar, it can actually be good, because it creates unity between your assets. So the main difference that I'm making here is to just make sure we kind of get that droopy hanging feeling. And then at the top, I'm sort of using the same principle as how our hair parts in the middle, just making it sort of hang off to either side. As for the interior of the asset, we don't need to overcomplicate things either. We just add a few of these droopy leaves, nothing more, and it looks fine. And once again, just because I conveyed my details this way, does not mean that you have to do it in a remotely similar way. I have my type of shorthand for communicating leaves, you might have a different one. That's good. But it's generally important that you as an artist conceptualize that you're trying to have a quick way to sell the idea for tree leaves. This artist create this kind of squiggly shape, not even trying to outline any individual leaf, but it still looks like a tree. Here we have some examples from Itora, where they have very distinct leaves and no outline. And you can even get a very different feel for your art even by doing something very similar to how I do it. If you look at how I made this here, since we went for very thick line art and very big shapes, it looks really doodly. But if you were to use thinner line art and smaller shapes, while still keeping that kind of rounded feel, we would be approaching these bushes in Nightwitch. Very similar approach, but very different feel. There will be similarities between how artists simplify things. It's just a given. But it's important that you really think about what you want to communicate and think about how you could do it. And if it looks bad, think about what it is about your shorthand, your simplification, that isn't working, and what isn't that makes another artist's shorthand and another artist's simplification work. But now we actually kind of have a tree. It looks nice. How do we signal the tree material? Once again, we have an insane amount of options depending on how we want our tree to feel. Here I'm just going for this kind of patchy tree bark look, really simple. And then I'm just hinting enough to sell that idea. This hatching on its own might look really off, but just hinting at this overall shape is enough to make it look kind of like a tree. I personally love drawing trees, so I personally mix this up quite a bit. Sometimes I go for a really intricate and swirly shorthand, Sometimes I go for a rough textured look. If we look at Itora, they're actually kind of trying to communicate the exact same type of tree bark that I'm trying to communicate. We're just using different shorthands, different simplifications to do it. Itora's version looks better than mine, but it's more time consuming to do, but both are kind of fine. If we look at Tales of Iron, they're really just hinting at how the tree textures follows to the top of the tree, while adding some holes and rough texture. Looks really good. I will say, as someone who really mixes up the shorthands I use for drawing tree bark, I don't think you necessarily should. I've created a couple of textures I really like and think look cool. I often reuse these shorthands because I know how I went about doing them, but getting it right the first time usually takes time. So if you switch it up a lot, you're probably going to make quite a few bad versions, quite a few bad simplifications, before you stumble onto something that works. And so if you keep switching it up, you'll be wasting time making bad art. You don't have to overdo it. Something simple like this works quite fine. So we throw this into our scene. Does it look good? Does it communicate that we're in a forest-like environment? Yeah, it does. And so we can move on. Let's make some bushes. So we have kind of done some bush-like and grass-like shapes already, but I still want to talk about it a bit more. We already know that you can get a bush by doing a round sort of shape, and then adding some bubbles with lines in the middle. It looks fine. But what I want to mention here is just to think about what you plan on using the bush asset for. If we look at our bush and add this amount of detail, while it looks good here, there is an argument that this kind of shorthand works somewhat less nice in the background. There's so much detail that if you stack it together, we don't really see this half circle. This doesn't have to be bad. There are situations where it can be good, and we will see it later. But if we take this asset here, and we just add it below the trees, we can see that it pulls a lot of attention in a bad way. We want to not highlight the detail, but highlight the shape. So how do we do that? Well, once again, we can still go for this kind of half circle shape, but do something closer to what we saw in Adventure Pals, and space out the leaves. Make it less like a bush, and more like a hill. The details themselves can be kind of similar, but the spacing is different, and if we place it in the scene now, we can see that it looks more open. If we look at how I personally tend to approach it, we can see in this scene that my bushes in the foreground tend to be more intricate and messy, whereas I often make my background assets devoid of detail. So assets that are close to us maintain the detail because they are close to us, whereas I try to highlight and maintain the shape for the background asset, minimize the detail. This does not mean that this bush is bad. It still looks good, but it can be important to think about how you want to use your asset and whether you want the player to mainly notice the shape or the details of that asset, and then obviously prioritize that thing. I'm also drawing another bush right now. Same principle, we will get into later why I'm doing this. Basically nothing complex though, just a slightly different silhouette to get some variety. So far we have looked at plants and then wood. Let's look at the other common material we see in games a lot, rocks. If we look at some rocks in 3 random games, we can see this rock in Cult of the Lamp, this rock in Islets, and this rock in Ori. In some regards they're slightly different, but they actually break down to quite similar ideas. Our shape, our silhouette, is either somewhat rounded or somewhat angular, somewhat pointy. So when we draw rocks, that is the principle we follow, somewhat round or somewhat boxy. So now that we have the shape of our asset, we need to think about our detail, our shorthand. What is the shorthand that artists tend to use when they do rocks? Well, while we do it differently, we still tend to highlight cracks or small nicks, or in general just a rough surface. So we can see this on the stone blocks in Rogue Legacy. Small lines, just to indicate that the surface isn't smooth. But I don't tend to do it this way. I tend to use an approach that is very similar to what we see in Wonder Boy. You have these kind of distinct cracks and these distinct holes. In reality, these are obviously quite complex, but we can translate this concept in quite simple terms for our art. And here's how the rocks would look in the scene. So now we come to architecture. How do we do architecture? Well, we have kind of covered how we can do materials. We have some shorthands for plants, some shorthands for rocks, and some shorthands for wood. So let's just make a stone building. So once again, we just start with the shape. A house is a square, so we add a square. Maybe we have some stone wall and a roof. At this moment, does this look like a house? Kind of, but not really. What if we add a chimney? Does this shape look like a house now? Yes. Is the shape interesting and exciting? Not really. Maybe we add a broken fence to the side here. Is the shape more interesting now? Yes. What if we add a stone pillar thing on the end here? Is this better? I think it is. You see, at this point we already have the entire idea for the house without having drawn anything. But you can see what I'm depicting by just looking at the shape. And once again, if we want to make it more interesting, we can still think about the shape. We could perhaps add some grass shapes here. Does it make it look more fun? Kind of. so let's keep it. Separating the details from the silhouette like this can be helpful precisely because it tells you if the shape is good. If you know the shape is good, but the asset looks bad, then you know it's your shorthand that isn't working. Since we're doing this heavy outline, we can kind of just trace the shape we have. Now, even though I have talked about the shape and the details as totally separate, how we make our details can obviously affect the shape. So we can, for instance, add this small accent thing to the roof here and alter the fascia, this side to the roof, to suggest the material. In this case, we make it a bit more metal-like. But you also don't have to be that inventive. We can add a windowsill and a door. Nothing special. Our shape already does some heavy lifting. Now, since we already do know how to do our shorthand for store blocks, we don't need to think that much. We just add these uneven blocks similar to bricks, and then add some cracks. Same for the door. We can add some shorthand for wood. And we can see now that by essentially just relying on how to communicate the shape of a house, and knowing how we simplify the details for a material, how we simplify the real world, we can very quickly and easily make any type of asset or architecture. But we aren't just going to make a house. We're going to make some other architecture as well. But before we do that, I want to just highlight how even if you do start out your asset like this, it can often be beneficial to split up the asset eventually. So if we take the house, we could cut the asset just above the door, and now we can make different versions for a roof, which still keep the same bottom part. This makes it so we can get a fairly consistent look with smaller texture sizes and still get some variety. So if we look at our scene, we could have gone for this roof, or this roof. I'm not going to work more on these versions, but just showcasing the idea of it. But essentially you can get better performance while also having to draw less. The same principle goes for our tree. It can often be beneficial to split the trunk of the tree from the leaves. It means you can swap the trunk with different versions, or add more leaves to get a fuller scene. On top of the reduced texture size, there are a multitude of other benefits to it. But you probably shouldn't do it too quickly though. And I'll show you why by splitting this at this early stage, and we will see later how this complicates my workflow. Now, on top of normal architecture, you might have some spikes. A spike is just a triangular thing, nothing much to it. But I do want to highlight one thing in regards to our shape. It's one thing to have our shape signal what the object is. This does look like spikes, but it's also fairly boring. And more importantly, it looks very artificial. So it can be helpful to not only think about how well your shape communicates the type of object you have, but what else it communicates. Here we could, for instance, add some uneven small boxes to the spikes to make it look less artificial. I would argue that this small change makes it look less like someone created it and more like this is something that could exist. Okay, now we've made some spikes. Let's continue with the architecture and make some pillars. Sometimes the details you add are really about altering the silhouette. Here I want some pillars that are kind of interesting, so I focus on how to make the shape interesting. If I think this pillar is too boring, I think about more ways to alter the shape to make it exciting and interesting. But I still don't have to go wild or learn something special. I just add a round ball at the top, and now we kind of have a podium-like pillar. So I don't have to execute perfectly or make it special. Just small individual decisions, each quite simple. A box, a smaller box, a bigger box, a circle. Each thing is simple to do. Add them all together and it looks fairly intricate. But as I said, it's still simple to do. If we check how it looks in game, it's not the best, but it's something. Now we did this as a pillar, but you could really follow the same principle for really any architecture stuff. Begin with the simple shape for the object, and slowly alter the shape to make it more interesting. To really sell this idea, let's make a lamppost. Now, a lamppost tends to be quite simple. The idea for them and how they might often look is just a thin rectangle with a ball on the top. It's fine to start here, but obviously there are different lamppost styles. You might get a bit of a bend where it hangs. If you start with that shape, then you just need to make some small alterations to that shape and you'll have something nice. We can see an old lamppost I made here, which is this more Gothic looking variant, similar to how Tim Burton might do it in Nightmare Before Christmas, for instance. I will say that while this style looks like what we would say is Gothic, I think this in reality is actually closer to Victorian era architecture. But I digress. This style is probably a bit more associated with Hollow Knight nowadays, but I do actually want to highlight the case of Hollow Knight, because I think they generally do something interesting with their architecture. If we take the lanterns we can see in Halloween Town in Kingdom Hearts, so how Tim Burton does it, they do have these type of curls. But if we look at Hollow Knight, they have really overloaded on these curls, essentially kind of copied snail shells, which fits the setting of Hollow Knight, the Bug Kingdom. It can always be valuable to try and find ideas in terms of how your world might solve a thing. But for our circumstances, we aren't going for this curly style. So how would we do our lamppost? Well, we start with the thin rectangle, But now we need to do our top here. Now it's generally advisable to have a mental picture of how a lantern, for instance, kind of looks. If you don't know, look at references. It isn't bad to do so. After all, if you really want to sell the Pictionary idea, we ought to kind of know how the object looks. The basic shape of a lamp generally breaks down to something like this, either round, diamond shape, or somewhat square. So we can always begin from the conception of that version, but make it fancier. So if we go for a kind of diamond version, but make it fancy by curving a line or two, well, we would get this. If you were to see this, you would hopefully already at this stage think of a lamppost, which means my job in terms of communicating the object is already complete. Now you might be asking yourself, how do I do the perspective in terms of this? And well, I don't do the perspective. I only wing it. I have a video on why you can kind of get away with this with game art, but basically I just curve it a bit to get some fancy perspective, but I don't actually follow any real perspective here. Once we have this, we might start thinking that the base of our shape is a bit too boring. So we just break it up a bit. How do you know how you should break it up? You just alter it in different ways until you get something exciting. Since the main rectangle shape is there, we already know it communicates what it needs to. Now we just make that boring rectangle shape less boring. Still kind of a rectangle, just a more interesting rectangle. You see, at this point, we actually have the entire asset, without any real details added. I can just outline this, and our asset looks kind of cool. The shape does the heavy lifting. Once again, if the shape works, the rest will follow. Which is why it can be problematic with being too fancy with textures or similar, because the shape is often what carries the asset. So what about other architecture? We made a house, and some pillars, and some stuff here and there. But your game might have a different setting, or perhaps require more complex things. Well, the principle is frankly the same. Start with the shape, and then add the details. And if you can hint at what the material of the object is, then use your shorthand for that material. Start simple, then add complexity once you know that your base works. So if we look at a completely different scene I've made in the past, it follows that exact principle. I start with a simple square sign, but then go back and make it more interesting with time. I also do think this principle of doing architecture is heavily affected by how good of a visual library you personally have stored in your head, which can take time to develop. So don't be afraid to use references. And not just by looking at the specific game. Don't just look at Hollow Knight, look at Victorian architecture. With time, you will develop shorthands for how to do things, and have a sense for how common objects tend to kind of look, like with lamps. As I said, there's a whole ocean of complexity you can go with architecture. How do the people live in this environment? How do they eat? Just know that this isn't easy, so give it time. Or don't do it at all. That's also an option. So now we have all our assets, and I have kind of staged the scene. The reason we work in this order is because this scene is frankly the thing that is important. The assets are just pieces to use to stage this scene, but this scene is the thing that we are making. We only draw in order to make the scene in our game look nice. So in my opinion, we need to get our assets into our game as quickly as possible, which we have done. If we like our assets now, then we can continue working on them. But how did I actually choose to make this scene? Well, this can get complex, but the base principle is just that we add trees with some spacing in between, and then further into the distance, we add another tree in that gap, so we stagger them unevenly, kind of similar to a brick pattern. As for the building itself, we just kind of had this framing here, so having a building in the distance could be like a centerpiece to our scene, a set piece that sort of ties the scene together. Whether or not you need to have this truly depends on your game. Quite often a piece like this in the distance can detract from the gameplay, so do think about it. But the idea for it is nonetheless the same. Here I also added some bushes in the foreground of the house, to differentiate the house from the rest of the scene. It's not only the shape of the asset itself that matters, but we also often need to be mindful of the shapes that start existing when we place our assets in the scene. Our hill kind of creates this shape, but we don't want to have this semicircle in front of this house, because it looks bad. We want something straight in front of the house, so this bush works significantly better. Just be mindful of the abstract shapes your assets create when you place them in the scene. Now while I made this scene, and this scene isn't too bad, I do want to highlight a few things. Because we went for a semi-forested and realistic scene, we are really forced to use quite a few layers and quite a few assets. If I don't have a rather thick coating of trees here, the scene will look too empty, and thus look kind of artificial. I would argue that we still kind of have too few trees here, but it's a tricky balance. But regardless, a big reason for why this is necessary is because we are trying to replicate the real world a bit. And in order to do that, we often need to put in quite a bit of textures and quite a bit of nuance. This richness and this nuance that we need to add to make something realistic is often quite labor intensive. We need to spend a lot of time making it look right.
What if we don't go for realism?
Suppose we just skip the trees and make weird bush-like shapes. Now our entire background is just this bush, but you can see if you can't draw, constructing a scene from a simple repeated asset is actually quite easy. You don't have to draw much, and you don't have to be encumbered with the complexities of the real world. Just make a bush pillar and it looks kind of cool. I made a similar choice when I talked about how Hollow Knight makes its art style. Here we have a bush rock pillar type thing. Not realistic really, but it's very little work in terms of drawing, and more importantly, it kind of looks nice. And I obviously made this choice in my video on Hollow Knight, precisely because of how often Hollow Knight uses this approach. Ghost Song also does something similar. And to sort of get ahead of ourselves, if we color this scene with just this bush and this bush in the background, can create this kind of look, which I think is a totally fine look. It's really performant and really easy to draw. So even though we in this case made this house with the trees, this ambitious scene, I think there's an argument that you could have a nicer scene by just skipping drawing all this other stuff. I still want to get into how we color and shade our assets. So how do we do that? How do we finish our asset? It all depends on how simple we want our art process to be. I'm just going to keep adding some highlights and shadows with this round syrup brush. So if we start with our tiles, all I do is start with the color bucket tool, switch my gray silhouette color to something different, and now since we're doing grass, let's add green. We can either go for one of these colder greens, a green that is closer to blue, or a yellower green. I think a fairly yellower green would work better in this case. So that's where we're starting. Now on a separate layer, I want to add some highlights. How do we do that? Well, we still don't need to overcomplicate things. As for the color itself, I always think it tends to look nicer if you use something called hue shifting. The idea behind the hue shifting is that if we have our base color, say green, then for our highlights, we obviously first need to shift up the brightness of the color. But rather than just shifting the brightness, we also shift down the saturation. So we move slightly left a bit. And then on top of reducing the saturation, we also move the hue. So the color itself is closer to yellow. Now for our shadows, we do the exact same thing, but the opposite. We shift down the brightness, increase the saturation, and shift our hue, so that our color looks closer to blue. Why do we do this? Well, it makes our colors look like this instead of this. This version without hue shifting is rather uninspired and flat. The same principle goes for basically any color we use. So for the highlights on our tiles, we shift up the brightness and make it a desaturated yellower green. How do we apply this highlight then? Well, we just follow the contours of our outline. So a trick I always use in order to do this quicker is to take my base layer and then use the magic wand and select everything outside of this base layer. Then I invert my selection and make a new highlight layer. Now I can just draw right up close to the edge of my asset without having to worry about it spilling out on the other end of the outline. We don't need to complicate things. For this asset, I'm actually going to ignore the shadows. But as you can see with this other tile sets I've made, the principle is just to add the shadow precisely where I don't have any outline. The further away you get from the edge of the tile, the darker it ought to get. Now, do we actually care what colors we add for this tile set? No. Until we actually place this asset together with all the other assets, we don't know if this works or not. We don't care if the colors look bad or good here. How it looks later on in the scene is where it matters. So, we move on to the next asset. Let's do the spikes. Now, the principle for every asset is kind of the same. We make the edges slightly lighter and the bottom of the asset slightly darker. We basically imagine that the light is coming from the top of the asset. This is the easiest way to do lighting for any game art. But with that said, even if you imagine that the light is coming from the top and shining down, if we have an object like these squares protruding, we would expect there to be a shadow below these boxes. So we add shadows and now we have this. It kind of works. Now we add a separate color for the box, now we add highlights. Light is kind of coming in from the top, so we add our highlights close to the outline. But now we have these whole things here. And since the light is coming from the top, we would imagine that the light is hitting this edge here. And so we light up the bottom of it. You see how that little choice kind of creates a nice illusion of a hole. The thing is, you might not now feel like that's intuitive. You might not now feel like, oh, I would know how to do that. But if you have made one hole, and you have made that illusion once, you know how to do it again. This is the idea of a shorthand. You make a simplification once, and then it's in your repertoire. It's in your visual library. And now you can go back to it and do it over and over and over again. If we want to extend this with some shadows, we would do the opposite. So shadows on the bottom line here, and the top line of the hole. Now the only thing left to do is to add highlights to the top of the spikes. You can do this in any number of ways. I choose to do it kind of dripping, so almost like an ice spike. It does not matter at this point though. We're only doing things to get a rough sense for how we want it. I could play around with the colors a bit, but frankly, until we place this into the scene, we don't know what will work. So we really ought to move on to the next asset. So let's do that. Is the principle for doing our tree brush any different? No, it's not. The colors we pick still use hue shifting. So if our base color is green, now the highlights will be slightly desaturated and yellower green. And we place this highlight on the edge of the asset, whereas our shadows are placed on the opposite end of any outline. So if you want these leaves to be in front of this other part and have this as a sort of overhang, to accentuate that, we place this bottom part in the shadow. And now we do the same for some of the other areas of this asset. We don't have to do it for every part. We could do that, but there's generally no reason to overwork things. When we're doing a shorthand, we only need to hint at the decision. We don't need to do it all the time. We need to give enough information, not all information. I would especially recommend not overworking things at this stage, because we don't know what we want yet. For our lamppost, we aren't getting more inventive. We pick the colors we kind of want our material to be, we use our magic wand tool so that we don't accidentally draw outside our asset, and now we can fill in the brown we're using in this case. The reason I'm recoloring this part instead of just using the color bucket tool is that I want this section to be a different color from these things here. So I generally want them to be on different layers. Once again, anything that is below another thing protruding ends up being in the shadow because our light is coming from the top. And you can see that when I add the shadow line, it just immediately adds some depth to our lamppost. And just as before, we continue with hue shifting, and we highlight the edges of our asset. And we can even drag a shadow line in the center column of our asset, just to add some more depth. And there we kind of have our asset. Do the colors look nice? Maybe, maybe not. But if they don't, we don't care. We move on. We don't overwork things at this stage. The easy thing with this is that even if it all seems complicated, once you've started doing a couple of assets this way, you end up realizing that it's basically all kind of the same. You see, while this lamppost is a thin cylindrical type object, a tree is also a kind of thick cylindrical object. So how do we shade our tree? Well, kind of exactly the same way we do our lamppost. We use the magic wand on our silhouette layer, and now we can draw freely. Even when we make a new highlight layer, we keep the same selection and just highlight the sides. Same thing for our shadow. We drag a darker line in the middle. Now, even though it looks different, it's kind of the same type of shading. We haven't done any complex shading as of yet, just added a silly line, really simple, but as you can see, it kind of works. How about the building tiles? Is it any different? Well, no. It's kind of the same way we did the spikes. The door is a different material from the wall, so we use a wood color instead of a stone color. Then we add shadows on the bottom of each block and highlights on the top. We obviously still need to remember to highlight the edges of the asset, but as you can see, we're kind of done and it looks kind of decent. Same principle goes for the top of our house, but I do want to point out that when I split this as before, I kind of urgent not do it at the stage we did it. Since I'm going to have to go back and color this, add shading and add texture, there's a big risk that this top part of the house won't match the bottom part. It's not just a big risk, it's precisely the problem I will run into. Premature optimization is bad, and for this reason I generally don't really like worrying about the canvas size the first thing I do. We can always adjust the canvas size later, so make it big. Give yourself some room to breathe, and then cut the canvas later on. I have a video on this, but we don't need to necessarily start out with powers of 2 or anything like this. We can adjust it later on when the asset is actually finished. Now we technically haven't added the rockstar scene. I don't really see a need for it in this scene, but the principle for how to shade them is still the same as anything else. Highlight the edges, shadow on the bottom, and if you want something to look as if it protrudes, then we add a shadow on the thing below. The only shading that is a bit different from the rest is this ball. Now there is more of a deeper discussion that can be had in terms of coloring a ball. It's like a favorite pastime of artists to shade balls. But we can just add a light on top and shadow on the bottom, and make the line sort of curved instead of straight. And now we kind of have a semi-okay approximation of a shaded ball. So with all our assets shaded in this super simple fashion, still with the hard round brush, we get this. It's not necessarily exciting, and perhaps it looks a bit flat, but it's easy to do and it doesn't look too bad. While fancy stuff like you see in Ori is nice, the artists that make this still understand how to handle the silhouettes of their asset. Artists like you see in Wonder Boy, they still have a good shorthand for how to do rocks. They add complexity, but they have a solid foundation. This is why it can be beneficial to learn how to do simple art first. As I've said before, my art, if I were to have complete freedom to do it, would look closer to this. Or perhaps like how I do my paintings. since those actually take closer to 20 hours to complete. But the difference between this and this is just time. Time to care about the details and the small things. So if you're new, it's better to start here and learn how to do this well, and then make the things that you really want to be complex. But what if we don't want it to look like this? What if we want it to be more goofy or exciting, less realistic? How would we do that? Well, before we go about changing colors, we could always evaluate if we like the staging as it is. I didn't overdo things here, and I think it kind of works. But we could argue that this bottom part of the building is a bit empty. So what if we add something to it? Should we draw another asset? Well, we could, but I always prefer starting out with what we have. So what if we just add these pillar things here? Does this look nicer? I honestly don't know, but it does make the front of the house less empty, so let's keep it for now. But okay, what about if we want to have more fun colors? Before we actually go into changing our colors completely, I actually want to showcase something. I talked about it in my previous video on color palettes. You see, in this scene, all our colors are kind of either green, brown, or gray. There's quite a bit of unity, but we don't really have a palette. We just picked a green and a brown and finished our assets. So because we have a lot of unity in our scene, it makes it look quite cohesive, but it doesn't pop. We don't have any accent colors to pull attention. What if we wanted it to pop? Do we need to change the colors completely? We could, but we don't actually have to. If we just look at some small parts of our scene, like the roof and the lamppost, this gray here actually kind of creates unity. But what if we made those small parts in a more bold color, like red? How would our scene look then? Well, it would look like this. I'm not saying in this case that this looks good. We still haven't picked colors based on what looks good. But we can see that this small change alters the vibe of the scene completely. It also kind of changes the composition. Now these pillars really pop and demand focus. Same with the roof and the lamppost. This is the idea behind accent colors. If you have a lot of unity in your scene, by adding a small sprinkling of an accent color, like red in this green and brown scene, you really shift the focus on the scene. Understanding this principle can be important in terms of composition, like it is here, but I think it's especially important when it comes to directing the player's attention when it comes to gameplay. If you were to select like a small box in the middle of the scene, an interactive box, and made that one red, you would highlight that thing. If you know how to direct focus, you can help the player see what's important in the game, while also helping them ignore the unimportant stuff. So what if we want to do some more smooth shading with gradations? How would we go about doing that? Well, there's basically two fairly decent ways of doing it. On the one end, we have the smudge tool. It exists in basically all drawing software and means you can just take the existing paint you have and smudge it a bit. So if we use the smudge tools on our tiles, we can see that it's fairly easy. We just drag the brush over our highlight layer and it just kind of works. I will say that you might have to play around with the brush sizes a bit, either increase the size or decrease the size in order to get it to work well. But as you can see, it works. Now we have that smooth gradation. The other method to do a nice smooth gradation is to use a soft brush. In this case, I'm using the noise brush. The benefit with using a paintbrush is that I can switch colors a lot during my shading. Just for the sake of variety, I'm redoing the colors here to a completely different thing. Once again, I'm not sure it will work out. I recommend here to use the selection wand in order to make sure you only draw on the asset, and then use a fairly large brush. Basically a bigger brush in the area you're covering, and just a few strokes. And you get a really nice smooth gradation like this. So I personally like the texture the noise brush offers, but the main point here is just how easy it is to get a nice smooth looking surface. It would probably be slightly more complex to do the shading with the noise brush on these intricate details, but for objects like this bush, just pick a big noise brush size and a different hue. A few strokes across the asset and you'll have something rather nice. You can see how even though I am not technically spending a lot of time, this noise brush actually gives us a rather nice look. So I'm switching colors on all these assets now. And as I said, the process is the same for all assets. But I do want to show you how quickly we can get this nice texture on something like this house. A big noise brush, alpha locking my layer so that I can only draw where I've drawn before, and now a quick stroke. And it just looks quite rich and carefully detailed, even though it's just the same asset as before. I'm doing this top here just the same, just trying to get a sparkly gold look for fun. If you're wondering how I do the sparkly gold look, I just go for one really dark color and then a one really light color on top. And now it looks more contrasty. And now since I went for a sparkly top, I'm also changing the door to that similar sparkly gold vibe. You could accentuate this even further if you wanted it to sparkle using normal maps, but I'm not doing that here. Now I will say that even during this process, I realized I was going too wild with it. And we can also notice that the scene looks way too blue. It's like Halloween overload. Finishing the assets doesn't change that. But it doesn't really matter, because we can always go back and switch the colors on our asset with adjustments. It doesn't take that long if we have a decent underlying structure, especially if we've made our materials like the wood and the rock on different layers. It's just to go in and slide the HSL bar. So if we go in and change the asset colors again, now we can see how this smooth gradation kind of works, especially on the leaves and stuff. So with that said, you can obviously play around with things quite a bit. This scene is simple in its aesthetic, perhaps a bit too simple. But as you can see, what comes with that simplicity is a rather easy process. And you can always layer complexity with time. How I make my most common scenes is really simple, with just a bit more work spent on my shorthands. I might skip doing this bubbly thing on all trees and go for something slightly more complex. But at the same time, the bushes and the stone blocks aren't actually that different. I invest time in the things that I think elevate the look, but the things I can keep simple, I keep simple. I'm intentional with my time. I do want to highlight that even though this scene looks fine,
You might still have to do finishing touches. For instance,
the downside of not having anything in the foreground is that it can become a bit too much of one thing. Hopefully you can see that. You can obviously just add things in the foreground to fix this, like I do in a lot of scenes, but depending on your scene, this might be less feasible, either due to performance issues or just platforming reasons. So what can you do at that point, if you don't want any foreground? Well, just to illustrate, I'm going to take this stone block asset from my tile map video and just layer the tile maps on top of each other. Now we partly have this small grass thing, but also some stone blocks. And we could obviously dress this even more and make it more intricate, like add holes to either side of this, just to break up the monotony. You could break up that monotony in part by altering the tile map, but you could also add small plants that cover the blocks. So if we look at this scene, we can see me use these small plants to dress up the blocks. If I just take those fine plants and add them in our scene here, we can see that it slightly changes the vibe and the look, and it breaks up the scene a bit more. Even though I don't really have any layers in front here, it takes our overloaded green tile map and moves it to something more balanced. So here we went for something more realistic looking, and I mean we're actually trying to portray reality, even though we use very simple shorthands. But obviously if we go for these blue fantasy colors and go for a complete bush background, then we would get this. We can see that we have basically just drawn one bush and made these pillar shapes out of these bushes, but it looks somewhat cool. So even though this is really simple to do, this is even less work. Less architecture. If you can't draw and you don't like drawing, I would really think about this choice. You can't really have your cake and eat it too. You can't have both super realistic characters and perfect buildings and not want to invest time into it. If you want to be ambitious, at least think about the trade-offs. Quality takes time. Now, since we're on the topic of quality and time investment, I do want to talk about how to make characters. When it comes to characters, this is one of those areas where I personally feel that what hurts beginners the most is that they're way more ambitious than their skills allow them to be. What do I mean by this? Well, I can paint this. I think I could probably manage to do fairly anatomically correct characters, like the ones you see in Blasphemous. But I recognize that it would take an immense effort on my part, and I'm not entirely sure I could do it well. It's something that is somewhat out of my depth. So the reason I go for these types of characters is because I know for a fact that I can accomplish something neat with this. I lower my ambition because I recognize my skill ceiling. So if you're watching this video and you are an absolute beginner, I would just say be careful with being too ambitious. Anatomy and animation is difficult and takes time to do well. Maybe you want to invest the time and energy into doing it, but just know that by doing so, there will have to be a trade-off somewhere else. Project Management 101. Time, quality, cost. Choose two. So what is the simple and easy way to do characters then? Well, skip anatomy. Focus on making the shape simple and interesting. The exact same skill we're already practicing with our environment assets. We make a simple blob silhouette with an arm and some legs, maybe some ears poking out, but don't focus on making it realistic. Then perhaps we can even go an extra length into making it goofy looking. Make it look intentional. But you can see how even though this is somewhat bad, it is more importantly quite easy to do. We could make lots of versions like this. We don't have to look up references, we don't have to overcomplicate things. We just make something goofy based on the enemy type. If the silhouette here kinda works, the character will probably work quite decently as well. So if we look at a game like Hollow Knight, which has these walking bugs, and we want to make a character like that, but for our fantasy scene, we might start out with a half circle. Add some antenna things to make it more fun. Okay, what is this? I don't know. It's a bit too simple and boring. How do we make it goofy? What if this is like a helmet or a hat? Okay, then we need to add the monster that is carrying the hat. So we add some legs and some arms that carry the hat, and in just a few seconds we have a goofy monster. Now you might think that this is kind of stupid, And it kind of is, but I do want to highlight why I'm doing this. Making things accurate and impressive takes references, effort, and skill. Making someone laugh or be creeped out, that's actually fairly cheap. Doing it in a lazy way can even make someone even more creeped out, or laugh even more. Which we can look at if we think of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where they had coconuts instead of horses. The decision to have coconuts came because they didn't have a budget for horses, but nonetheless, that just made it better. You don't have the skill to do good character design, so make it funny character design. If we look even further at the animation of these characters, they are equally simple. We don't even need to know how to animate. We just separate the helmet from the body, so now we have an underlying squid-like monster and this helmet on a separate layer, and then we add the helmet again. Now we can just bob the helmet up and down. We don't even have to redraw stuff. We could even do this animation in our game engine. Then perhaps we could warp the character a bit to add some craziness and add a few different feed frames. It doesn't need to be perfect, because we aren't replicating anything real. Now in less than 15 minutes of work, here we have the rough draft of an animation on a character that didn't exist 20 minutes ago. We could obviously try and do the same thing for this other character. And once again, we could start by just cutting part of the character and moving the image up and down to make it look like it's opening its mouth in a kind of goofy way. But for a character like this, we probably do have to redraw stuff a bit. With some onion skinning on, we can see the previous frames and the next frames. If you're rigging your animation, this would look different, but the principle is the same. With some onion skinning on, we can see the previous frames and the next frames. We don't have to worry too much about the rules. We just make some goofy changes like this arm lifting up and down. And if we play the animation, I guess it kind of somewhat works as a rough draft. Now you'd obviously have to think of how the enemy would attack and similar like that, but you get the point. This character has a mouth, it would probably try and eat the player. How do you do that? Well, it doesn't matter. You want to make it funny. You want to make it appealing, not accurate. There's obviously more to it. But even if you do want to be ambitious for some characters, I really do think it can be worthwhile to have a baseline that is simple and easy for you to do. Characters take time to make. It's really labor intensive. So if your simple enemies are more like this rather than this, it ensures that you have time to finish them. Maybe you can be more ambitious with your player character or some bosses, but just be careful about the decision. Islets is an example of a game that partly has the complex, but it also has the really simple and goofy. Even Rogue Legacy has a lot of enemies that are really simple to do compared to what we know that they can do. Now, while we could spend time coloring and fixing the animation even more, you kind of get the point. The principle of this animation could kind of work in the game. You might have to make this character more fantasy looking and less sci-fi looking, but at this point you understand that the process for doing so is the same as for everything else we have done in this video. As I said, I'm releasing all of these messy assets on my Patreon for free. They're not production ready, but if you find use for it, they are there. I want to reiterate one last time that even though this is perhaps simpler than you want, and maybe you think this looks bad, if you kind of like how I tend to do my art, this is generally the principle I follow. I just do some things with slightly more ambition. Thanks for watching. Bye.